Welcome to History and Ashes, where the past does not vanish, but lingers quietly in the details we too often ignore. Tonight, you set sail not into the middle of a raid or a saga of kings, but into the soil, the frost, and the wind that shaped the Viking world, long before their ships ever touched foreign shores. If you want to understand the Vikings, you cannot begin with swords, you must begin with the earth beneath their feet. The Viking Age, as we often imagine it, is a stretch of centuries filled with raids and exploration. But before the year 700, before the monks at Lindisfarne wrote terrified notes of strangers from the sea, the people who would become known as Vikings were simply farmers, hunters, and fishermen in the harsh northern lands of Scandinavia. Their world was narrow, and it was cold. Winters dragged on, pressing down with hunger, and summers, though brief, brought fierce labour, for every handful of grain or fish had to be gathered and stored. If they failed, death was not dramatic. It was simply starvation, slow and quiet, passing through entire households. Scandinavia was not a place of plenty. The land was stubborn. You might picture wide fields of wheat, but in truth, much of the soil was rocky, thin, or boggy. The forests were dark and heavy with pine and spruce, but they did not always give easy wood for ploughing. The seas, however, were alive. Fish swarmed in coastal waters, seals lined the icy shores, and whales could be hunted if one was daring enough. To survive here, people learned not to demand from the land, but to bend themselves around it. They farmed small patches, kept hardy animals like sheep and pigs, and built houses half buried in earth for warmth. Every detail mattered. A poorly built roof could mean a winter of dripping water on your bed. A badly chosen plot of farmland might mean hunger 2 seasons later. It is easy to forget that before the sagas and the myths of Valhalla, most people lived lives as ordinary and as repetitive as yours. Day after day, they worked. They dug ditches, cut wood, hauled water from wells, ground grain by hand into flour, and patched clothing until it nearly fell apart. A woman's loom was not a symbol of art, but of survival, because without constant spinning and weaving, a family had nothing to wear. A man's axe was not always a weapon, but a tool for splitting logs. There were no spare minutes, and there was no margin for laziness. But in this quiet struggle lay the seeds of something greater. Geography and climate shaped their character. The coasts of Norway were riddled with fjords, long narrow inlets of the sea that cut deep into the land. To move between them, people turned to the water. Boats were not luxuries, they were lifelines, connecting small farms to neighbours, markets, and distant kin. In Denmark, flat and marshy lands allowed more farming, but also made people look outward, toward the Baltic Sea, for new opportunities. In Sweden, forests and long rivers stretched toward the east, offering a natural road into unknown lands. The environment itself whispered to them, move, travel, seek. Before raids ever began, this movement already existed. Archaeological finds tell us that Scandinavians traded amber, the golden fossilized resin that washed up on their shores far into Europe. Bronze Age carvings show ships long before the first Viking ship was built. The Norse were not suddenly born as raiders. They were shaped by generations of living in a place that demanded flexibility, cooperation, and a restless search for resources. If you stood in a Scandinavian village around the year 600, what would you see? Perhaps a cluster of longhouses, their wooden frames covered with turf and thatch, smoke rising from central fires. Livestock would wander close, pigs rooting in the mud, sheep huddling together, dogs barking at strangers. The air would be thick with the smell of dung, wood smoke, and salted fish. Children would carry buckets of water, not for fun, but because without it, their families could not cook or drink. Old men and women would sit by fires, telling stories, sometimes of gods, sometimes of ancestors, sometimes of nothing but practical warnings about frost and famine. Religion was already present, though not yet the grand mythology we often imagine. People honored local spirits, made offerings to unseen powers, and feared the dark places of the forest, Odin and Thor were known, but they were not yet carved in stone or sung in long epic poems for common folk. For most villagers, religion was as dull and as constant as the weather. You made sacrifices when needed, you said words at births and deaths, and you hoped that whatever powers existed would not turn against you. Now, you may wonder, why here? Why did such an unlikely place, full of hardship, give birth to people who would sail farther than any of their European neighbours? The answer lies partly in necessity. When you live in a land where the soil betrays you and winters rob your strength, you learn to look outward. The sea is not a barrier, it is a road. The forest is not just a wall, it is a resource. And when local resources run thin, you are forced to imagine what lies beyond the horizon. The Vikings would later be remembered as warriors, but they were first and foremost survivors. The image of a Viking with an axe in hand is not wrong, but it hides the truth. That axe was also a farmer's axe, a shipbuilder's axe, a tool used every day to cut wood for warmth. When food grew scarce, survival sometimes meant violence, but often it meant trade, negotiation, and cleverness. A man might raid one year and settle peacefully the next. A woman might manage a farm alone for years while her husband was gone, making her the true anchor of daily survival. Imagine lying in your bed on a winter night in a smoky longhouse, listening to the wind howl outside. The walls creak with the cold. Your stomach is only half full because the grain had to be rationed. Across the fire, your mother weaves, your father sharpens tools, and your grandmother murmurs a story of trolls lurking in the forest. This was the world before the raids. Hardship was constant, but life had rhythm, and in that rhythm grew both endurance and ambition. It may surprise you to learn that the Vikings were not originally united. There was no single Viking nation. Instead, there were dozens, even hundreds, of small communities, villages, clans, and petty kingdoms, each with its own leader, its own customs, its own ambitions. The lack of unity meant conflict was constant. Neighbouring farms fought over land, herds, or honour. Blood feuds were common, and violence was often local, not foreign. In many ways, the first Viking raids on Europe were simply an extension of the violence they already knew, turned outward instead of inward. And so, the roots of the Viking story are not in gold, not in glory, but in mud, frost, and survival. They were ordinary people forced by their environment to be resourceful, restless, and resilient. Out of this came the daring to sail farther, to risk more, and eventually to carve their mark across continents. But here is the thought to leave you with. If the land of Scandinavia had been fertile and easy, would the Viking Age have ever begun? Or was it precisely the hardship, the thin soil, and the endless winters that made these people restless enough to change the course of history? If you were to step into a Viking settlement, the first impression would not be of raiding or feasting, but of work, constant, endless work. What movies and sagas rarely tell you is that Viking life was mostly spent in rhythm with the seasons, and those seasons were unforgiving taskmasters. Raids and voyages were only small interruptions compared to the daily grind of farming, fishing, and keeping families alive in a land that could just as easily starve you as sustain you. The centre of life was the longhouse. Imagine it stretching like a wooden ship turned upside down, its frame sturdy with oak beams, its walls lined with turf or planks, and its roof thick with thatch. Inside, a single fire burned down the centre, smoke curling upward through small holes. It was warm, smoky, and crowded. Families lived here with their livestock during the winter months. Yes, that meant cows, goats, and sheep were sometimes kept in the same space as people. The smell was thick, but warmth was a greater concern than comfort. You would sleep side by side on raised platforms, furs wrapped tightly, listening to the crackle of fire and the snorts of animals nearby. Food was the heartbeat of survival. You might imagine roasted meat on great platters, but the truth was more repetitive. Barley and rye formed the base of most meals, boiled into porridge or baked into flatbread. Fish was plentiful, and so dried cod or herring might hang from rafters, ready to be eaten through the winter. Meat was rarer, saved for feasts or slaughtered only when animals could no longer be fed. Dairy milk, butter, and cheese was a constant, and fermented drinks like mead or ale were safer to drink than water. Every mouthful had to be planned for. If food stores ran out before spring, hunger and death spread quickly. The work of farming fell across every member of the household. Men ploughed and sowed fields with simple wooden ploughs often pulled by oxen. Women tended livestock, brewed ale, preserved food, and spun wool into thread. Children carried water, collected firewood, scared birds away from crops, and learned by doing. In Viking society, idleness was impossible. Even the youngest found themselves useful, or at least expected to be. Winter was not a time of rest. Though outdoor farming halted, it was a time of maintenance. Tools had to be sharpened, nets repaired, wood chopped, clothing patched. Every household had a rhythm of chores, and without them, survival faltered. Archaeologists have found fragments of combs, spindle whorls, and bone needles, showing just how much time went into small, ordinary crafts that rarely appear in sagas. Yet it was these dull, repetitive tasks, stitching a tier, weaving a length of cloth that kept the settlement alive. And here is something easily forgotten. Viking women carried immense responsibility. While men might leave for trading voyages or raids, women often managed entire farms alone. They oversaw planting, harvesting, and household stores, making them the backbone of Viking survival. Norse law even recognized this power. A woman could divorce her husband, reclaim her dowry, and sometimes even manage property independently. These details do not appear in the dramatic tales of battle, but they mattered far more for daily survival. Trade was another lifeline. Settlements were not isolated. They exchanged goods constantly. Salt, essential for preserving fish and meat, often had to be imported. Iron for tools and weapons was precious, and villages that had access to it were critical hubs. Farmers might trade wool or hides for grain, or amber for foreign luxuries. This constant network of exchange tied even small households into larger systems, stretching across Scandinavia and beyond. Clothing was practical, layered, and built for durability. Wool was the staple fabric, spun and woven into tunics, trousers, and cloaks. Linen, when available, was used for undergarments. Shoes were made of leather, often stuffed with wool for insulation. Bright dyes, reds, yellows, and blues were used when possible, giving clothing a surprising splash of color in an otherwise grey world. Jewelry, too, was common, not always as decoration but as portable wealth. A silver arm ring might be both an ornament and a way to store value that could be broken off and used in trade. The social fabric of a settlement was tightly woven. Families lived together, but they were also bound to neighbors through kinship, oaths, and obligations. Feasts were essential social events, binding people through shared food and drink. They marked births, marriages, funerals, and seasonal changes. A feast was not just about eating, it was about reinforcing alliances, repaying debts, and displaying generosity. A chieftain who failed to provide food and drink for his people risked losing his standing. Hospitality, too, was sacred. A traveler could expect shelter and food because refusing it was a mark of dishonor that could lead to feuds. Yet life was not without violence. Feuds over land, insults, or honor often spiraled into bloodshed. The absence of a central government meant disputes were settled at local assemblies, called things, where free men gathered to make decisions and pass judgments. Compensation, known as wergild, was often paid for injuries or deaths, turning vengeance into a structured form of justice. Still, the possibility of violence always lingered, and weapons were as much symbols of status as they were tools of defense. Even a simple farmer might keep a spear or axe close at hand. Children were raised in this world of constant work and looming danger. They learned skills by watching parents, girls learning spinning, weaving, and farm management, boys learning farming, woodwork, or fighting. Games existed too, often preparing children for adult roles. Wooden swords, simple board games, and competitions of strength filled small moments of leisure. but childhood was short. By the age of 12 or 13, children were already taking on adult tasks, and by their late teens, many boys were ready for voyages or raiding. Religion continued to thread through daily life. Small household shrines might hold offerings to local gods or ancestors. Fertility of crops and livestock was a constant concern, so rituals often centered on ensuring good harvests. Blots, or sacrifices, might be made with animals, feasts, or small offerings. These were not distant or grand ceremonies, but woven into daily needs because in a land where survival was fragile, divine favor was always sought. And then there was the sea. Even inland communities felt its pull, for rivers and lakes served as roads. Boats of all sizes dotted Viking settlements, from small fishing craft to the larger vessels that would later carry warriors across oceans. Building and maintaining them required immense labor, and every man was expected to know at least the basics of rowing and sailing. The sound of water against wood was as common as the crackle of a hearth. The pace of Viking life was not one of adventure, but of repetition. You woke, you worked, you ate, you slept, and you repeated. Days blurred into seasons, seasons into years. Yet, out of this monotony came strength and endurance. Without the quiet grind of farming, fishing, weaving, and repairing, there would have been no raids, no exploration, no sagas to tell. The settlement was the heart that sustained the outward adventures. So as you picture a Viking settlement, set aside the horned helmets and roaring battles. Instead, imagine the endless spinning of wool, the scraping of ploughs through stubborn soil, the smell of smoked fish curling through rafters, and the laughter of children chasing each other between animals in the mud. This was life ordinary, repetitive, essential, and here is the thought to carry forward. Do we remember the Vikings more for their rare moments of violence, or should we instead remember the thousands of ordinary hands that spun thread, tilled fields, and mended nets, the quiet work that truly kept their world alive? Before the word Viking became synonymous with raiding, it was tied to something quieter, but just as powerful: trade. Long before monasteries were plundered and villages set aflame, the people of Scandinavia were already restless travelers, carrying amber, furs, and iron down rivers and across seas. To think of Vikings only as raiders is to miss the foundation of their world, because it was trade and exploration that built the networks, the ships, and the skills that later made raiding possible. Imagine the coastline of Scandinavia around the year 600. Small settlements cling to rocky shores, boats pulled up on beaches, smoke drifting from longhouses. Farmers work small patches of soil, but some men turn their eyes to the horizon. They know the amber that washes ashore along the Baltic is prized by people far to the south. They know that their furs soft squirrel, fox, and even bear can fetch tools, glass beads, and metals they cannot easily produce at home. And so, before bloodshed, there was barter. Amber was among the first great treasures of the North. It is only hardened tree resin, but its golden glow held a magic that captivated ancient peoples. Beads and pendants of amber from Scandinavia have been found in graves as far away as Greece, dating to centuries before the Viking Age. To gather amber, Norsemen combed stormy beaches, searching through seaweed and driftwood for nuggets thrown ashore. These pieces were then shaped and polished, carried southward through networks that stretched across Europe. What began as simple exchange with neighbors slowly expanded, as contacts widened and distant markets called furs were another lifeline of trade. In the cold north, animals were plentiful, and their pelts could be turned into cloaks, caps, and linings for boots. But beyond practical use, they were luxuries elsewhere. Wealthy nobles in the Frankish kingdoms prized soft furs, and Byzantine markets valued them even more. To obtain silver, wine, or silk, Norse traders carried bundles of carefully prepared hides down rivers and across seas. In this way, what we think of as wilderness, forest animals, and icy coasts was quietly transformed into a currency of survival and wealth. Iron, though less glamorous, was perhaps even more important. Scandinavia had deposits of bog iron, formed naturally in wetlands. Though harvesting it was laborious, it allowed small communities to forge tools and weapons. A farmer with a sturdy iron axe or plough could manage land far better than one without. As production grew, so too did the ability to trade iron with neighbours, spreading both tools and influence. Archaeological evidence shows Scandinavian iron reaching places far beyond where it was produced, proving that long before raids, there was already a steady flow of northern metal outward. And in return, what came in? Glass beads from the Carolingian world, finely worked silver from the Abbasid Caliphate, wine from France, silk from Byzantium. Even in small settlements, excavations have uncovered beads of foreign glass and coins from distant empires. Imagine the awe of holding a Byzantine coin in a small Scandinavian village, the face of a faraway emperor pressed into its surface. Such objects were not merely possessions, they were connections to a larger world, proof that the horizons were wider than the fjords. These exchanges did not always travel directly. More often, they passed through middlemen. Frisians along the North Sea coast were skilled traders, linking Scandinavians with the Frankish kingdoms. Slavic peoples around the Baltic served as both partners and rivals. Slowly, step by step, northern traders extended their reach. They learned foreign tongues, foreign customs, and foreign routes. The skills they honed, navigation, bargaining, diplomacy, would later serve them well when violence entered the picture. It is worth pausing to consider how these journeys actually unfolded. A trader might leave his home in spring, when seas thawed and rivers opened. He and his companions would load a small ship with amber, furs, and iron tools, then row or sail along coasts, stopping at markets and settlements. Nights were spent on beaches or in the houses of trading partners. Meals were simple: dried fish, porridge, maybe fresh game if luck allowed. There was no guarantee of success. Storms could wreck a ship, strangers could betray them, and bandits could strike along rivers. Yet the rewards, silver, wine, new tools, were tempting enough to keep the journeys alive. These traders were not always separate from farmers. Often, they were the same men, balancing agriculture at home with seasonal voyages. A farmer might spend most of the year tending crops, but set out on a journey when the chance arose. This dual role blurred lines. A man might be a peaceful trader one year, then return as a raider another. The skills, tools, and contacts overlapped. In truth, the Vikings were never just one thing, they were what circumstances required. Markets themselves became crucial gathering points. Along the Baltic and North Sea, seasonal markets drew people from wide regions. Archaeological finds from places like Hedeby in Denmark show bustling centres where traders exchanged goods, languages, and ideas. Hedeby grew from a simple settlement into one of the most important trading towns of northern Europe, with streets, workshops, and harbours full of ships. Long before raids made headlines in monastic chronicles, Hedeby and places like it were already shaping Scandinavian wealth and identity. Slavery also played a role, though it is an uncomfortable truth. Even in these early days, people were traded as goods. Captives taken in small conflicts could be sold southward, where foreign markets paid high prices. The Norse called slaves thralls, and their presence was a quiet undercurrent of trade. This was not yet the large-scale raiding for captives that would come later, but the beginnings were there. To understand Viking trade, one cannot ignore the human cost. And trade was not only about goods, it was about knowledge. With every voyage, Scandinavians learned more about the wider world. They learned of monasteries filled with silver chalices, of undefended towns along coasts, of rivers that stretched deep into rich lands. They saw the strengths and weaknesses of their neighbours. Information was a form of wealth, and it spread quietly through trading journeys, long before raiding turned that knowledge violent. Religion, too, was touched by these exchanges. Foreign objects with Christian crosses found their way into pagan villages, perhaps admired for beauty rather than meaning. Spices, fabrics, and new foods gave glimpses of other ways of life. Slowly, these encounters planted seeds of curiosity and tension, shaping the transformations that would come centuries later. when Scandinavia itself converted to Christianity. But perhaps the most lasting gift of trade was the ship. Without constant seafaring, the skills to build and handle advanced vessels would never have developed. Early trade voyages demanded sturdier, faster ships, and craftsmen rose to the challenge. The famous Longship did not appear overnight. It was born from generations of traders demanding better tools for their journeys. Each voyage refined designs, each failure taught lessons. By the time raids began in earnest, Scandinavians already possessed the ships and the seamanship that made them unstoppable. So when you think of the Viking Age, pause before imagining fire and blood. Picture instead the quiet clink of amber beads, the soft weight of a fur bundle, the sound of haggling voices at a riverside market. Picture a man rowing home after months away, bringing foreign silver to his family, stories to his children, and perhaps new ideas to his village. This was the true foundation of the Viking story. Not plunder, but exchange. And here is the question to leave you with. If trade had remained strong enough, if goods and ideas had flowed freely, would the Vikings ever have turned to raiding at all? Or was violence inevitable in a world where survival so often balanced on the edge of scarcity? History often remembers moments of first contact, those flashes when one world collides with another so suddenly that the shock echoes for centuries. For the Vikings, that moment was the summer of the year 793, when the monastery of Lindisfarne in Northumbria was struck by raiders from across the sea. Chroniclers wrote of it as if the world itself had cracked open. Yet to understand it, you must picture not just the horror of the monks, but also the steady path that led from trade to violence, from barter to plunder. The coastlines of Europe had long been familiar to northern traders. They knew where markets stood, where rivers opened, and most importantly, where monasteries and towns kept their wealth. Through trading voyages, Scandinavians had seen chalices of silver, books bound with decorated covers, and treasures meant for worship. They had seen buildings poorly defended, protected more by prayers than by walls. To men who had grown up in lands of scarcity, the contrast was striking. Here, across the sea, were places where wealth was stored, but where men did not fight to defend it. The monastery of Lindisfarne was not chosen at random. It sat exposed on a tidal island, accessible by boat. For nearly a century, it had been a centre of Christian learning and devotion, its monks copying manuscripts, preserving knowledge, and praying in seclusion. But to outsiders, it looked less like a sanctuary and more like a storehouse. When the Longships arrived that summer, their dragon-headed prows cutting through the water, there was little the monks could do. They were farmers, scribes, and shepherds of souls, not warriors. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the moment with trembling words. Fierce foreboding omens came over the land of Northumbria, terrifying the people most woefully. There were immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the sky. These signs were soon followed by great famine, and not long after, on the 6th day before the Ides of January, the ravaging of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne. To the monks, the attack was not only violence, it was cosmic punishment, a sign that God's anger had found them. But to the raiders, it was opportunity. They struck fast, looted chalices and crosses, carried off captives to be sold as slaves, and fled back across the sea before local forces could react. It was not the first Viking raid. Earlier skirmishes along the English coast and in Ireland had already occurred, but it was the first so widely recorded. Lindisfarne became the symbol of a new era, the moment when Europeans first realized that their coastlines were no longer safe. Why monasteries? The answer lies in their peculiar vulnerability. Monasteries were wealthy, often filled with gold and silver offerings, but unguarded. They stood in isolated locations, close to water for transport, making them easy to reach by ship. To the raiders, it was practical. To the monks, it was sacrilege. The Norse had no concept of Christian sanctity. A church was no different from any other building. To them, treasure was treasure, regardless of its holy use. The shock of this cultural clash deepened the sense of horror. From Lindisfarne, raids spread quickly. In Ireland, Monasteries at places like Iona and Kells were struck. Along the Frankish coasts, towns such as Nantes and Rouen were attacked. Each raid followed the same rhythm: a sudden arrival, swift violence, looting, and escape. Local forces struggled to respond because the Longships allowed raiders to strike unpredictably, vanish back to sea, and reappear elsewhere. It was not overwhelming armies, but small, fast-moving bands that created such disproportionate terror. And yet, these early raids were not only about wealth, they were also about survival and experimentation. A successful raid could bring back food, tools, slaves, and silver, easing the burden of a harsh winter. For younger warriors, it was a way to gain honor and reputation. For chieftains, it was a way to demonstrate generosity, redistributing loot at feasts to secure loyalty. In this sense, raids were not mindless violence, they were part of the social fabric, a new strategy woven into old systems of survival and status. The monks and chroniclers saw raiders as demons, men from the edges of the world sent to punish the faithful. But for the Norse themselves, the act was not cosmic, it was practical. Where the chroniclers saw blasphemy, the raiders saw opportunity. This gap in perspective widened the horror of the encounters, because one side viewed the violence as incomprehensible evil, while the other saw it as no more strange than hunting or fishing. It is easy to picture only blood and fire, but archaeological evidence reminds us that raids were also economic choices. Silver coins from the Abbasid Caliphate have been found in Scandinavia, showing how quickly loot was converted into long-distance trade. A chalice taken from a monastery might be melted down into smaller silver pieces, shared among warriors, or traded for goods. Captives became thralls, forced into labor back home or sold in distant markets. The raids were violent, yes, but they were also folded into a wider system of exchange and survival. Imagine for a moment the fear of a coastal villager in Ireland or England during these first years. You might be tending fields when a watchman shouts of ships on the horizon. You run to gather family, but by the time you reach the village, the raiders are already there. Smoke rises, people scream, and the sea seems to spit out men who vanish as suddenly as they appear. There is no warning, no pattern, no clear defense. That terror, the sense of helplessness, spread faster than the raids themselves, reshaping the psychology of entire coasts. But it is worth remembering, too, that the raiders were few. Early Viking raids involved small groups, perhaps 20 to 50 men. They did not conquer or settle, they struck and withdrew. Their power lay not in numbers but in surprise. For the first decades, European rulers underestimated the threat, treating the raids as nuisances rather than systemic danger. This underestimation gave the Vikings room to grow bolder, to refine their ships, and to extend their reach. The image of Lindisfarne burned itself into memory, but it was only the beginning. Soon raids became annual, and the fear of dragon-prowed ships haunted coastlines from Ireland to the Mediterranean. Yet those first raids carried something beyond terror. They marked a turning point, when Scandinavia shifted from isolation into direct confrontation with the rest of Europe. The line between trader and raider blurred, and the world would never be the same. So here is the thought to leave with. When you think of the first Viking raids, do you imagine only the horror of the monks, or can you also see the quiet logic of men who, hardened by thin soil and long winters, saw a monastery not as sacred but as a storehouse, and chose to take what they believed the sea had offered to them? If there was one tool that defined the Vikings, it was not the sword or axe, but the ship. Without ships, there would have been no raids, no exploration, no settlements in Iceland or Greenland, no fleeting footsteps in North America. The ship was the lifeblood of the Viking world, as essential as the plough or the hearth. To step onto one of these vessels was to step into the heart of what made the Viking Age possible. At first glance, Viking ships were simple, long, narrow, and wooden, with a single sail and a row of oars. But their brilliance lay in their balance. These ships could glide through deep ocean waters, yet slip just as easily into shallow rivers. Their keels were shallow, meaning they could approach coasts, sail upriver, or even be dragged across land when necessary. No European vessel of the time matched their flexibility. Where a Frankish ship might require a port, a Viking longship could be pulled onto a beach, turned over, and used as shelter. That mobility gave raiders and traders alike an unmatched freedom of movement. Building such a ship was no small task. It began with wood oak when possible, for its strength and resilience. Planks were split, not sawn, to follow the natural grain of the tree, giving them durability against the stress of waves. These planks were overlapped in a style called clinker building, fastened with iron rivets. The overlapping design allowed the hull to flex, bending with the sea instead of resisting it. The result was a vessel both strong and light, able to endure storms yet fast enough to strike swiftly. The sail, made of wool, was equally vital. It was not just a square of cloth, but a carefully woven and treated fabric, often strengthened with animal fat or fish oil to resist water. Dyeing sails red or striped gave them not only beauty, but visibility, a declaration of presence on the sea. With both sail and oars, ships could travel swiftly in fair wind or foul. Rowers could move them silently at night, while the sail carried them great distances by day. Navigation was a skill both artful and practical. There were no compasses in the early Viking Age, but there were keen eyes and sharp memory. Mariners learned to read the sun, the stars, the color of the water, the flight of birds, even the smell of the air. They watched for drifting seaweed, for the shape of waves reflecting from unseen shores, for the way cloud formations hinted at land. Some evidence suggests they used sunstones, crystals like Iceland spar, to detect the position of the sun even on cloudy days. Whether legend or fact, it shows the ingenuity demanded by survival at sea. Yet voyages were not glamorous. Life aboard a longship was harsh. Imagine 40 to 60 men packed tightly, each with little more than a chest for belongings. That chest doubled as a seat when rowing. Meals were simple: dried fish, bread, and sometimes porridge cooked in a cauldron at the ship's center. Water was stored in barrels, often going stale. Ale or mead was safer but ran out quickly. Sleep came in short bursts, on open decks, wrapped in cloaks against wind and spray. Storms drenched men to the bone, and cold gnawed constantly. There was no shelter from seasickness, no escape from hunger when supplies ran thin. A voyage might last days or weeks, with no guarantee of landfall. The risks were immense. A sudden storm could swamp a vessel, scattering men and cargo into the sea. Navigation errors could strand a crew on a barren coast. Illness spread easily in cramped conditions, and wounds from battle festered in the salt air. Yet men returned to these voyages again and again. Why? Because the rewards silver, slaves, land, and honor were worth the risk. To survive a voyage was itself a badge of resilience, a mark of a man's strength and endurance. It was not only the longship that defined their travels. There were also nars, broader cargo ships used for trading and settlement. These could carry more goods, more animals, and even families, allowing for the migration that carried Norse people to Iceland, Greenland, and beyond. Nars were slower, less suited for raids, but vital for building communities. In them, cattle lowed, sheep bleated, and families huddled together as they crossed vast stretches of ocean, gambling their futures on distant lands. Archaeological finds bring these ships to life. The Oseberg ship, buried in Norway around the year 834, revealed intricate carvings along its prow, blending artistry with function. The Gokstad ship, built for sea travel, showed a sturdier, broader design. Each discovery shows that ships were not just tools, they were symbols of power and prestige. A great chieftain was measured not only by his haul, but by the ship he commanded. To own one was to own the key to wealth, travel, and influence. These vessels also shaped the way raids unfolded. A fleet of longships could strike a coast suddenly, scatter defenders, and vanish before reinforcements arrived. But just as easily, they could turn inland, gliding up rivers like the Seine or the Thames, reaching towns that believed themselves safe far from the sea. This ability to merge coastal raiding with inland penetration was revolutionary, and it terrified rulers across Europe. But beyond war, ships enabled exploration on a scale that still astonishes. From Norway, sailors reached the Shetlands, Orkneys, and Hebrides, settling islands that became springboards for further voyages. From Denmark, traders sailed across the North Sea to England, the Frisian coast, and beyond. From Sweden, river routes carried them deep into what is now Russia, linking them to the riches of Byzantium and the Caliphate. The very design of the ships made these networks possible, connecting distant worlds with surprising speed. Consider the courage required. To row into open sea without a compass, trusting in memory and the flight of birds, demanded both skill and nerve. For every successful voyage, there were likely failures lost to storms and silence. Families waiting on rocky shores may have watched the horizon for weeks, only to accept that their husbands, brothers, and sons would never return. The sea gave opportunity, but it took lives with equal generosity. And yet, to the Norse, the sea was not only danger, it was identity. Songs, stories, and sagas are filled with ships, with journeys, with horizons. A man might be remembered not for the land he owned, but for the voyages he had taken, the seas he had crossed. The ship was more than wood and sail, it was a vessel of memory, carrying the dead in burial, the living in exploration, and the dreams of future generations in its prow. It is telling that even in death, ships remained central. Burial mounds shaped like ships, or actual ships filled with goods and laid to rest, testify to their symbolic weight. A man or woman interred in a ship was believed to continue a journey into the afterlife. Just as the sea carried them to new lands, so too would it carry them beyond this life. In this way, the ship was not only practical but spiritual, a bridge between worlds. So when you imagine a Viking voyage, think not only of the dragon-headed longship crashing through waves, but also of the quiet details, the creak of oars in unison, the stale taste of water in a barrel, the wet wool of a cloak clinging to chilled skin, the constant prayer that land would soon rise on the horizon. These were not mythic figures, but ordinary men enduring extraordinary risks, bound together by wood, sail, and willpower. And here is the thought to linger on. Was it the brilliance of the shipbuilders that gave the Vikings their reach? Or was it the sheer willingness of men to step into those fragile vessels, with no promise of return, that truly made their world expand? When you hear of Vikings, the image that most often rises is of longships slipping into the mists of the British Isles. Few places bore the brunt of their ambitions as heavily as England, Scotland, and Ireland. For the Norse, these islands offered fertile land, rich monasteries, and fractured kingdoms ripe for exploitation. For the people who lived there, the arrival of dragon-prowed ships marked centuries of disruption, violence, and uneasy coexistence. The story begins in the late 8th century, with a raid that became infamous across Europe, Lindisfarne, in the year 793. This holy island off the northeast coast of England was home to a monastery renowned for its learning and piety. To the monks, the sea was a shield, a natural defense against the chaos of the mainland. But to the Vikings, it was a highway. When their ships landed, the monastery's treasures were looted, its monks slaughtered or enslaved, and its sanctity shattered. News of this attack rippled through Christendom. It was not the first raid of its kind, but it was the one that seared the Vikings into memory as scourges of the Christian world. From that moment, raids multiplied. Coastal monasteries, towns, and villages across Northumbria, Mercia, and Wessex felt the lash of sudden strikes. The very qualities that made the Vikings' ships remarkable, their speed, their shallow draft, their ability to move from sea to river, made defense almost impossible. By the time a local army could gather, the raiders were gone, sails on the horizon, ships laden with silver, cattle, and captives. At first, these raids were seasonal, opportunistic. Crews would sail in the summer, plunder, and return home for the winter. But gradually, ambition grew. Some raiders saw not only wealth but land, fertile soil for farming, harbours for trade, a permanent foothold beyond Scandinavia. By the middle of the 9th century, raiding parties swelled into great armies, staying through the winters, demanding tribute, and carving out territory. England, divided into smaller kingdoms, was especially vulnerable. Northumbria fell into chaos after a Viking attack captured York in 866. The so-called Great Heathen Army, a coalition of Norse warriors, swept across the land, breaking kingdoms and installing puppet rulers. Mercia was overrun, East Anglia subdued, and Wessex under King Alfred the Great faced near annihilation. Alfred, through resilience and cunning, managed to preserve his kingdom, defeating the Vikings at Edington in 878. His victory forced a treaty that divided England into two spheres, Wessex and the south for the Anglo-Saxons, and the northeast Danelaw for the Vikings. The Danelaw was more than a line on a map. It represented the integration of Norse settlers into English life. Towns like York, which they called Jorvik, became bustling centres of trade, where Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon cultures mixed. Laws, language, and customs blended. Even today, English place names ending in by or thorp mark Viking settlements. The Norse did not merely raid, they stayed, built, and reshaped the land. In Ireland, the story was equally dramatic. The island's patchwork of small kingdoms, often at war with one another, presented opportunities the Vikings seized. Early raids struck monasteries like those at Iona and Kells, places famed for illuminated manuscripts and sacred relics. But by the 9th century, Norsemen began founding long forts, fortified bases along rivers and coasts. From these strongholds, they could raid inland or control trade. Some of these outposts grew into cities that endure to this day: Dublin, Waterford, Limerick. Dublin, in particular, became a major hub, not only for trade in goods like silver, slaves, and furs, but for Norse political power in Ireland. Yet the Irish did not simply bow to Viking dominance. Battles were fought, alliances forged and broken. Norse rulers sometimes allied with Irish kings against rivals, weaving themselves into the island's complex political tapestry. Over time, some Vikings settled, married into local families, and adopted Gaelic customs. Their descendants became the Hiberno Norse, a people neither wholly Norse nor Irish, but something in between. Scotland, too, felt the Viking tide. The Northern Isles, Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides were colonized, their Pictish and Gaelic inhabitants either absorbed or displaced. From these bases, Norse influence extended into the mainland and across to the Isle of Man. These islands remained under Norse control for centuries, their culture shaped by Scandinavian settlers. Even today, echoes of Norse language and tradition linger in those northern fringes. What did these expansions mean for daily life? For many local populations, it meant instability, fear, and violence. A monastery that had been a center of peace and learning might suddenly burn. Villages could be emptied of men, women, and children, carried off as slaves to be sold in Dublin or across the seas. Yet in other cases, it meant new trade, new goods, new bloodlines. Norse silver coins circulated alongside Anglo-Saxon pennies. Farmers traded surplus with settlers who introduced new techniques. The Viking Age in the British Isles was not solely an age of terror, it was also an age of transformation. The cultural fusion was profound. Norse words entered the English language, influencing dialects still spoken today. The mingling of art styles produced distinctive hybrids, seen in carvings, jewelry, and manuscripts. Religion, too, played a role. While the early Norse clung to Odin and Thor, by the 10th and 11th centuries many had converted to Christianity, blending their old myths with new faith. Churches rose where long forts once stood, signaling both change and continuity. It is easy, from the modern view, to cast the Vikings as destroyers alone, but in truth, they were also settlers, traders, and assimilators. Their presence in the British Isles was as much about building as it was about breaking. By the end of the Viking Age, the landscape of England, Scotland, and Ireland had been forever altered not just politically, but linguistically, culturally, and genetically. And yet, one cannot forget the human cost. Imagine being a monk at Lindisfarne, watching dragon-headed ships emerge from the fog, knowing your sacred place was about to be desecrated. Imagine a farmer in East Anglia, seeing smoke rise from your village as raiders carried off neighbors into slavery. Or, from the other side, imagine being a Norse settler, carving a farmstead in foreign soil, wondering if your children would be accepted as part of the land or forever strangers. The story of the Viking expansion into the British Isles and Ireland is thus a story of extremes of violence and assimilation, of destruction and creation, of terror and opportunity. It reminds us that history is rarely neat, rarely divided into heroes and villains. Instead, it is woven of countless lives, some lost in fire, others carried into new beginnings. By the time the Viking Age waned, the Norse presence in these islands had left permanent marks. From the Danelaw in England to Dublin in Ireland, from the Hebrides to the Isle of Man, their legacy persisted long after the sails vanished from the horizon. The British Isles were never the same again, reshaped by men who arrived first as raiders and stayed as neighbours. When you think of Vikings, perhaps you picture them thundering into English monasteries or seizing Irish ports. But their ambitions carried them further still, across the waters into Francia, the land that would one day become France. Here, along the rivers Seine and Loire, the Vikings found fertile ground for raiding, and eventually for something even more enduring. Settlement and transformation into a new political power, one that would carry Norse influence deep into the heart of medieval Europe. The first serious Viking raids on Francia began in the early 9th century, during the reign of Charlemagne's successors. The Carolingian Empire, once strong under Charlemagne, fractured after his death. His grandsons divided the empire, weakening its defences and leaving rivers and coasts exposed. To the Vikings, this was an irresistible invitation. Using their shallow draft longships, they sailed up rivers that cut into the very heart of Francia. Imagine being a farmer living miles inland, thinking yourself safe from sea raiders, only to see sleek wooden ships sliding silently upriver, warriors leaping ashore with axes gleaming. In the year 845, a Viking leader named Ragnar, whose historical existence is still debated, led a fleet of more than 100 ships up the Seine to the very gates of Paris. The city, still small compared to what it would become, was poorly defended against such an onslaught. The Frankish king, Charles the Bald, paid the Vikings a staggering sum of silver to go away. Tribute, or danegeld, became a common feature of this period. Time and again, the Franks found it easier to buy peace than to fight. To the Vikings, this was not only profitable but a recognition of their power. But payments did not guarantee safety. Raids continued, intensifying in the later 9th century. Paris, Rouen, and other towns were sacked multiple times. Monasteries were looted, treasures stripped, and captives taken. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, all became highways for Norse ships. The Frankish annals record a sense of helplessness, chroniclers lamenting how the invaders appeared from nowhere, unstoppable, their sails blotting the horizon. Yet these incursions were not only about plunder. As in England and Ireland, some Vikings sought permanent footholds. The fertile lands of northern Francia offered rich soil for farming, while its rivers provided access to trade routes. By the early 10th century, Norse bands were not only raiding but settling, wintering in fortresses, and negotiating with local rulers. The turning point came in the year 911. The Viking leader Rollo, sometimes called Hrolfr, had carved out a base along the lower Seine. Charles the Simple, king of the West Franks, realized he could not dislodge them by force. Instead, he chose diplomacy. In a treaty, Charles granted Rollo and his men land around Rouen in exchange for loyalty and defense against further Viking attacks. This land would become known as Normandy, the land of the Northmen. This was a moment of transformation. Rollo, a pagan warlord, became a Christian duke, swearing fealty to the Frankish king. His warriors received land, settling with families, farming, and building fortifications. Over time, the Norse language blended with local Romance tongues, giving birth to Norman French. Paganism gave way to Christianity, though Old Norse customs lingered beneath the surface. In a few generations, the descendants of Viking raiders would speak French, build stone castles, and fight not as marauders, but as knights. What makes Normandy fascinating is the speed and depth of this cultural assimilation. By the mid-10th century, the Normans had already distinguished themselves from their Scandinavian ancestors. They adopted Frankish feudal structures, intermarried with local nobility, and developed a distinct identity. Yet their Norse roots remained visible in names, in maritime prowess, and in a fierce martial spirit. Normandy became a powerhouse of medieval Europe, producing warriors who would shape history in ways their Viking forebears could scarcely have imagined. Consider the legacy of Rollo's descendants. His great-great-grandson was William the Conqueror, who in the year 1066 crossed the English Channel and defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings. With that victory, the Normans not only claimed England, but transformed its culture, language, and governance. The English court began speaking French, castles rose across the countryside, and the entire trajectory of England shifted. All of this traces back to the decision of Charles the Simple to grant land to Rollo, a desperate gamble that birthed a dynasty. But Normandy's influence extended far beyond England. Norman knights and adventurers became a kind of military elite, sought after across Europe. In southern Italy and Sicily, Norman mercenaries carved out kingdoms, defeating both Byzantine and Arab rulers. They carried their blend of Norse boldness and Frankish sophistication into the Mediterranean, leaving behind churches, castles, and dynasties that bore the stamp of their hybrid identity. The creation of Normandy also reveals something broader about the Viking Age, that the Norse were not merely destroyers but adapters. Where they could not conquer outright, they negotiated, settled, and absorbed. Their genius lay not only in raiding but in survival, in the ability to change shape to suit the world they entered. Normandy was a crucible of this transformation. Within a century, raiders had become dukes, their longships replaced by war horses, their pagan gods by the Christian cross. Still, one must remember the human cost. For those who lived in northern Francia during the 9th century, Viking incursions meant years of terror. Villages burned, fields were trampled, and families were torn apart by slavery and war. Monks who had dedicated their lives to quiet contemplation found their monasteries pillaged, their books and relics scattered. The Norman state, so often celebrated for its later achievements, was born of violence and fear, and yet, in the paradox of history, that same violence gave rise to stability. Normandy became a bulwark against further Viking raids, its dukes policing the coasts with vigor. In time, it stood not as a threat but as a partner within the Frankish kingdom, contributing to the patchwork of medieval Europe. Think for a moment of the transformation on a personal level. A Viking warrior who had once followed Rollo into battle now found himself farming land in Rouen, raising children who spoke a language he barely understood, attending a church service to a god he had not been raised to honor. Within 2 generations, his grandchildren would consider themselves French, though their blood carried memories of fjords and sagas. This is how cultures shift not in sudden leaps, but in quiet, generational turns. By the end of the Viking Age, Normandy stood as proof of the Norse capacity to endure by adaptation. It was no longer a Viking stronghold, but a Norman duchy, a place where Scandinavian roots had intertwined with Frankish branches to create something new. And from this duchy would emerge not just William the Conqueror, but a legacy that shaped the politics, warfare, and culture of Europe for centuries. If you think of Vikings, your mind may leap first to England, Ireland, or France, where their raids are most vividly remembered. Yet some of the most profound Viking legacies were not written in the West, but in the East, along the great rivers of present-day Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. Here, Norsemen known as Varangians ventured far from their homelands, trading, raiding, and eventually ruling over vast territories. Their story in the East is less well known to many, but it is essential for understanding how Viking history intertwines with the origins of medieval Slavic states. The geography itself invited this expansion. Scandinavia lies only a short sail across the Baltic from the river mouths of Eastern Europe. Once ashore, the Vikings discovered a natural network of waterways, the Dnieper, the Volga, the Don, and countless tributaries. These rivers linked the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, and beyond to Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire. They also connected to the Caspian, opening routes toward Persia and the Islamic caliphates. To seafaring Scandinavians, used to threading fjords and crossing stormy seas, these rivers offered something astonishing: highways into the very core of Eurasia. Archaeological finds give us a glimpse of this eastern enterprise. Viking burial mounds have been uncovered along riverbanks in Russia, filled with swords, scales for weighing silver, and ornaments from as far away as Byzantium and Baghdad. In markets along these rivers, Norse traders exchanged furs, slaves, and amber for silk, wine, and coins. Arabic silver dirhams, minted in Samarkand or Baghdad, have been found in Scandinavian hoards by the thousands, evidence of a trade network stretching across half the known world. But trade was only one part of the story. The Vikings who ventured east were also warriors and rulers. The primary chronicle, a medieval Russian account, tells us that in the mid-9th century, Slavic tribes invited the Varangians to bring order to their lands. Whether this was a genuine invitation or a retrospective legend, the chronicle names a figure called Rurik, who established himself in Novgorod around the year 862. His dynasty, the Rurikids, would rule in various forms for centuries, laying the foundation of what became known as the Kievan Rus. From Novgorod, Rurik and his successors extended their reach southward, seizing control of Kiev, a city strategically placed along the Dnieper River. By the late 9th and 10th centuries, Kiev had grown into a powerful center, enriched by trade flowing north and south. The rulers of Kiev, often of Norse origin but surrounded by Slavic subjects, became intermediaries between the steppe nomads, the Byzantine Empire, and northern Europe. One of the most striking episodes of this era is the Vikings' repeated encounters with Constantinople, or Miklagard as they called it, the Great City. The Varangians launched raids on Constantinople in the years 860 and 907, sailing their river fleets into the Black Sea and appearing at the very gates of the Byzantine capital. These assaults were brutal, but they also led to treaties. The Byzantines, recognizing both the danger and the potential of these northern warriors, recruited them as mercenaries. From this arrangement emerged the famed Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine army made up largely of Norsemen. For a Viking, joining the Guard was a chance at wealth and prestige. They swore loyalty to the Byzantine emperor, serving as his personal protectors. Accounts describe them as fierce, loyal, and often unruly. Some of the sagas tell of young Scandinavian men setting out to go into the east, hoping to win fortune in Constantinople. There they would wield their axes not against monasteries but in defense of emperors. Within the Kievan Rus itself, Norse influence blended with Slavic traditions. The rulers, often with names echoing their Scandinavian origins, Oleg, Igor, Olga, gradually adopted the culture and religion of their subjects. Princess Olga of Kiev, regent in the mid-10th century, famously converted to Christianity and journeyed to Constantinople. Her grandson, Vladimir the Great, cemented this transformation by officially adopting Orthodox Christianity in the year 988. With his baptism and the mass baptism of the people of Kiev, the Rus turned decisively toward Byzantine culture and faith. This was a watershed moment. The Norse origins of the ruling dynasty faded into the background as the Slavic Christian identity of the Rus took precedence, yet the Viking contribution remained embedded in the structures of power and the trade networks that sustained the realm. In the early stages, the very idea of centralized rule in Eastern Europe was tied to the arrival of Norse leaders like Rurik and Oleg. The methods of riverine travel, the networks of trade, and the military discipline of the Varangians all shaped the early state. Daily life in the Kievan Rus reflected this fusion. A merchant in Kiev might handle furs from the north, wax and honey from Slavic forests, and fine cloth from Byzantium. A warrior might be of Scandinavian descent, his sword a Frankish import, his armor a Byzantine gift. Pagan traditions lingered for generations, with rituals tied to Norse gods mingling with Slavic deities, even as Christianity gained prominence. For the common people, survival meant adapting to this fluid cultural world, sowing crops, navigating harsh winters, and living under rulers whose authority came as much from riverborn Norsemen as from local chiefs. It is easy to forget how fragile this new political structure was. The Kievan Rus was not a nation in the modern sense, but a loose federation of cities and tribes, bound by trade and the power of dynastic rulers. Viking-style raiding was never far from the surface. Rival princes fought for supremacy, and steppe nomads frequently tested the borders. Yet the mere fact that this vast region began to cohere at all owes much to the arrival of Norse leaders who understood the value of controlling rivers and forging alliances. In time, the Scandinavian element faded into memory, replaced by a distinct Slavic Christian identity. But traces remain in the sagas, in archaeology, and in the very name Rus, which many scholars believe derives from an Old Norse word for rowers or seafarers. The people of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine carry in their origin stories the imprint of those Viking adventurers who paddled their ships into the unknown. What is striking about this eastern expansion is its contrast with the western story. In England, the Vikings became kings through conquest and assimilation. In Normandy, they became dukes by negotiation. In the East, they became the founders of dynasties, shaping political entities that outlived their own Scandinavian identity. This adaptability, raider, settler, ruler, mercenary, was the essence of the Viking legacy. Pause for a moment and picture a scene along the Dnieper in the 10th century. A fleet of longships glides southward, crews hauling vessels across portages where rivers do not meet, their cargoes heavy with furs and captives. At a riverside market, traders haggle in a dozen languages: Norse, Slavic, Greek, Arabic. Above the market rises the wooden hall of a Norse prince turned Rus ruler, its banners fluttering. It is a place of constant movement, of shifting identities, where the Viking spirit of exploration merges with the vastness of the Slavic world. The eastward expansion of the Vikings reminds us that their age was not only about plundered monasteries and burning villages. It was also about the weaving of connections across continents, about the strange and sometimes fragile bonds between people who had once been strangers. From the Baltic to Byzantium, from Kiev to Constantinople, the Norse carved paths that reshaped the medieval world. When you think of Vikings, you might picture narrow seas, rivers, and raids close to home. Yet some of their most daring ventures carried them not south to wealthy empires, or east into vast rivers, but west far out into the cold, grey Atlantic. These journeys were not the violent raids of the British Isles, nor the dynastic politics of the Rus, but something different: the search for land, survival, and new beginnings. The first stop on this Atlantic frontier was Iceland. The island had been known, vaguely, to northern sailors for some time. Irish monks are said to have reached it earlier, seeking solitude. But in the 9th century, Norse settlers began to arrive in earnest. Their reasons were varied. Some were fleeing political conflicts back home. Others sought new farmland in a world where Scandinavian land was scarce. Still others wanted freedom from the growing power of kings and chieftains in Norway. Imagine that voyage for a moment. You are aboard a longship, leaving the fjords of Norway behind, the sea stretching endlessly. Days pass, the wind whips, and the crew watches the horizon with weary eyes. Then at last mountains rise out of the fog, black rock against grey skies. Iceland, a land of fire and ice, where volcanoes smoulder and glaciers carve the earth. The settlement of Iceland was not a mere scattering of farms, but the creation of a society. By the year 874, settlers had begun establishing homesteads along the coasts, where the land was most fertile. They brought with them livestock, seeds, and traditions. In the centuries to come, Iceland would become famous not for its riches, but for its unique political experiment, the Althing. Established around 930, this assembly gathered chieftains and free men to settle disputes and make laws. In an age dominated by kings and warlords, Iceland's settlers created a form of governance that was unusually collective. Life in Iceland was harsh. Winters were long, summers short, and the soil often thin. Families lived in turf houses, relying on sheep, cattle, and fishing. Yet they also created a rich culture. The sagas, written centuries later, preserve tales of these early settlers, feuds, voyages, and family struggles. These stories are among the greatest literary treasures of the medieval world, capturing both the heroism and the hardship of life on the Atlantic edge. But the Vikings were not content to stop in Iceland. From there, they pressed further west, reaching Greenland. The very name Greenland is a story in itself. According to the sagas, it was Eric the Red, a fiery-tempered outlaw exiled from Iceland who discovered the island in the late 10th century. He named it Greenland, perhaps to lure settlers with the promise of fertile land. In truth, Greenland was anything but green. The coasts offered patches of usable pasture, but most of the island was locked under ice. Still, for Norse settlers, the lure of new territory was irresistible. Around 500 people followed Eric, establishing 2 main settlements along the southwestern coast. Life there was even more precarious than in Iceland. The settlers raised cattle, sheep, and goats, hunted seals, and later traded walrus ivory with Europe. Their survival hinged on fragile balances between human need and the unforgiving environment. Greenland also placed the Norse in contact with new peoples, the Inuit, who had long adapted to Arctic life with skills the Norse lacked. Relations were uneven, sometimes trade, sometimes conflict. Over time, the Norse presence in Greenland dwindled. Climate change, isolation, and shifting trade routes eventually led to the abandonment of the Greenland colonies by the 15th century. But for centuries, these settlements stood as proof of Viking endurance on the edge of the habitable world. And then, beyond Greenland, lay something even more astonishing: North America. The sagas tell of voyages to a place they called Vinland, rich with timber, grapes, and game. The most famous of these stories involves Leif Erikson, son of Eric the Red. Around the year 1000, Leif is said to have sailed west from Greenland and reached new shores. The descriptions in the sagas are tantalizing coasts with wild grapes, forests, and open meadows. For a long time, scholars debated whether these tales were myth or history. But in the 20th century, archaeological discoveries at Longships Meadows in Newfoundland confirmed that Norse settlers had indeed reached North America. The site revealed remains of turf houses, ironworking, and artifacts unmistakably Norse. Here, for a brief moment, Europe and the Americas touched centuries before Columbus. Yet the Norse presence in Vinland was short-lived. Unlike Iceland and Greenland, North America was not colonized by them. Why? The reasons are complex. Distance made it difficult to sustain settlements. The indigenous peoples, the Skraelings, as the sagas call them, resisted these intruders fiercely. And perhaps, for the Norse, the costs outweighed the benefits. Timber and resources could be obtained closer to home, while Vinland remained too far, too contested, and too uncertain. Still, the voyages to Vinland stand as one of the most remarkable chapters of Viking history. They reveal not only courage but also restlessness, a drive to push beyond every horizon. These were not mere raiders anymore, but explorers who stretched the known world. Daily life in these Atlantic colonies was marked by resilience. Imagine a family in Greenland, a turf farmhouse dug into the earth, warmed by animal skins and a central fire. The father trades walrus ivory, the mother tends sheep, the children help gather lichen for winter feed. Every day is a struggle against scarcity, yet there is also a sense of pride in taming a land where few others could survive. Or picture a crew in Vinland, building simple shelters, fishing in rich waters, wary of the arrows of native peoples. These were not the grand halls of Norway, but outposts carved into wilderness. What these Atlantic ventures show us is another side of the Viking world. Not only warriors and traders, but settlers and survivors. The Atlantic expansions demanded endurance more than plunder, patience more than battle. They tested whether Norse culture could transplant itself into the harshest corners of the earth, and in a way, they succeeded. Iceland remains a thriving nation to this day, its culture deeply rooted in those early settlements. Greenland, though its Norse colonies are gone, still carries echoes of Eric the Red's gamble. Vinland, though fleeting, proved the scope of Viking ambition across an ocean into a continent unknown to the rest of Europe. It is easy to underestimate this achievement. To cross the Atlantic in open ships, without maps or compasses, relying on the sun, stars, and the flight of birds, that was a feat of navigation almost unimaginable. The Norse may not have built permanent empires in America, but they were the first Europeans to set foot there, centuries before the age of exploration began. So when you hear of the age of discovery beginning in the 15th century, remember that long before Columbus set sail, Viking longships had already touched American shores. Their voyages did not transform the world in the same way, but they remind us of the boldness that defined the Viking spirit. Pause for a moment and picture yourself standing on a cliff in Vinland. Below you, the ocean roars. Behind you, Norse shelters dot the coast. Across the waters lies Greenland, and beyond that Iceland, and beyond that the fjords of Norway. You are at the edge of the world as your people know it, facing a continent that stretches into the unknown. For all its hardships, it is a moment of wonder, a reminder that the Viking Age was not only about destruction but also about discovery. When we speak of Vikings, it is easy to imagine only raids, swords, and longships. Yet for the vast majority of Norse people, life was not spent on distant shores or stormy seas, but on farms and in villages, tending to land and family. Daily life was a constant negotiation with the elements, the seasons, and the resources at hand. Understanding this side of Viking life offers perhaps the clearest insight into what it meant to survive and even thrive in Scandinavia. Homes were the center of existence. Most Norse families lived in longhouses, structures built of timber, stone, or turf, depending on what resources were available. A typical longhouse might be 50 feet long but only 20 feet wide, with a central hearth running down the middle. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through carefully constructed vents. Within, space was divided by function rather than walls. Sleeping platforms along the sides, work areas near the hearth, storage for food, and tools in corners. Privacy was limited, and comfort was minimal, but the longhouse provided essential shelter against harsh winters. Life within the longhouse was communal. Families often extended, with grandparents, uncles, and cousins lived and worked together. Everyone had roles to play. Men were responsible for hunting, fishing, and protecting the farm. Women managed food preparation, animal care, textile production, and the domestic economy. Children learned skills from a very early age, handling tools and animals under the watchful eyes of parents. Elders passed down stories, proverbs, and practical knowledge. Even the most ordinary chores were infused with necessity. Survival demanded diligence, skill, and cooperation. Farming was at the core of Viking life. Crops varied depending on latitude and soil, but barley, rye, oats, and wheat were staples. Livestock cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and horses provided food, labor, and materials for clothing. Fishing supplemented diets along coasts and rivers, while hunting deer, elk, and wildfowl offered protein and hides. Every season required careful planning, planting in spring, tending crops in summer, harvesting in autumn, storing food for winter. Failure could mean starvation, so work was constant and meticulous. Food preparation was laborious. Grains were ground into flour using hand mills or querns, then baked into dense bread or porridge. Meat was preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. Milk was turned into cheese or butter. Vegetables were limited to hardy root crops, cabbages, and herbs. Meals were modest but functional, aimed at sustaining bodies rather than delighting palates. During the long winter months, families relied heavily on preserved foods, and rationing was often necessary. Clothing, like homes and food, reflected both practicality and status. Wool and linen were the primary fabrics. Men and women wore tunics, trousers, and cloaks, layered for warmth. Wealthier individuals might wear garments dyed with imported colors or embroidered with intricate patterns, signaling status or lineage. Leather boots and belts were common, and furs provided essential insulation. Clothing was not disposable, repairs were constant, and even children's garments were patched repeatedly. Religion and ritual also shaped daily life. Before the widespread adoption of Christianity, Norse belief centered on gods like Odin, Thor, and Freya, along with a complex system of spirits and ancestors. Offerings were made at household shrines, in sacred groves, or at burial mounds. Festivals marked seasonal transitions, particularly the solstices, bringing communities together to feast, sacrifice, and celebrate survival. Even in ordinary chores, belief was present, invoking protection over fields, livestock, and families. Trade and craft added another layer to daily existence. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and weavers provided vital services, while merchants exchanged goods locally and abroad. Vikings exported furs, amber, iron, and slaves, importing silver, silk, glass, and luxury items from distant lands. Some towns, particularly along the coast, became centers of exchange, where rural and maritime life intersected. These hubs linked isolated farms to a larger world, creating networks of interdependence and opportunity. The social hierarchy shaped interactions and responsibilities. At the top were chieftains, landowners who oversaw large areas, collected tribute, and led men in war. Freemen farmed their plots, owed service to local leaders, and enjoyed certain rights within the community. Thralls, slaves, or bonded laborers worked the hardest tasks, often captured in raids or born into servitude. Life for a thrall was harsh, but even they played a role in sustaining the larger society. Their labor enabled freemen and chieftains to pursue trade, raids, or political maneuvering. Violence was never far from daily life, even at home. Disputes over land, honor, or inheritance could lead to feuds lasting generations. Swords, axes, and spears were both tools and weapons. Training began young. Boys practiced hunting, wrestling, and wielding arms, preparing for both defense and potential raiding. Even women learned protective measures, managing livestock and securing the homestead in the absence of men. Survival required constant vigilance. Health and medicine were rudimentary. Injury and illness were common threats. Herbs, poultices, and simple surgical techniques were used, but mortality rates remained high. Childbirth was perilous, and epidemics could devastate communities. Yet the Norse adapted with remarkable resilience, passing down knowledge that allowed families to endure in a challenging environment. The human capacity to persist amid scarcity and danger defined their world as much as the thrill of conquest or exploration. Leisure and storytelling offered respite from toil. Skalds, poets, and storytellers recited tales of gods, heroes, and ancestors, reinforcing cultural memory. Music, games, and feasts punctuated seasonal cycles, creating rhythm and meaning in otherwise grueling lives. Even simple pastimes, such as board games or wrestling, fostered community bonds and skill development. As you imagine this world, it becomes clear that Viking life was a balance of labor and risk, ritual and practicality, community and survival. The image of raiders and warriors, while true for a subset, only captures the most visible layer of Norse existence. For most, life was about the steady, quiet endurance of daily tasks, the constant work required to keep families fed, homes standing, and livestock healthy. Pause and picture a moment in a longhouse at dusk. Smoke curls from the central hearth. Children kneel on the floor spinning wool, while elders tell tales of distant voyages and legendary ancestors. Outside, the wind howls over frozen fields, but inside, there is warmth, food, and the rhythm of survival. It is ordinary life, yet it is extraordinary in its persistence and adaptation. Daily life is often overlooked in history because it seems mundane. But for the Vikings, it was essential. Raids, exploration, and conquest depended entirely on the ordinary skills of men and women who farmed, traded, built, and endured. Without them, longships could not sail, settlements could not thrive, and the Viking Age itself would have been impossible. And so, one is left to wonder how much of what we admire in Viking history, their expansion, their exploration, their legendary feats, rests on the invisible labor of ordinary people, quietly mastering survival, day after day, in a land that demanded everything from them? When you picture Vikings, it is often the clash of steel, the roar of longships, and the terror they brought to distant lands that comes to mind. Yet Viking warfare was more than brute force. It was a system of strategy, social organization, and psychological insight that allowed a relatively small people to dominate larger, wealthier societies. Understanding Viking war tactics offers insight into why these men and women could repeatedly strike fear into the hearts of kings and monks, shaping history far beyond Scandinavia. Viking raids were carefully planned, even when they appeared spontaneous. Longships, the hallmark of Norse ingenuity, were essential to this. Their shallow draft allowed navigation not only across open seas but up rivers deep inland, reaching targets that seemed secure. For example, the Seine, Thames, and Loire became highways into the heart of Francia and England. The design of these vessels allowed speed, surprise, and the ability to retreat as quickly as they struck. Raiding parties were organized with remarkable discipline. Leaders selected crews based on skill and loyalty. Ships were loaded with weapons, supplies, and often livestock or trade goods for bartering. Scouts would reconnoiter potential targets, observing defenses and terrain before an attack. Timing was critical. Raiders often struck during festivals, harvests, or periods when defenders were distracted, maximizing the psychological shock of sudden violence. The psychological aspect of Viking raids was central. They cultivated an aura of terror deliberately. The dragon-headed prows of their ships, the shouting of warriors, the gleam of axes and swords, it was intended to unnerve opponents. A monastery or village confronted by a fleet of 20 or 30 longships might surrender without a fight, paying tribute to avoid slaughter. The Vikings understood that fear could be as effective as combat. A small, disciplined force could control regions far larger than themselves, simply by projecting menace and unpredictability. Viking weaponry reflected both practicality and efficiency. Axes were common, versatile tools used both for labor and combat. Spears allowed engagement at distance, while swords, often status symbols, were used by wealthier warriors. Shields, round and often painted, were essential for both defense and formation tactics. Armor was minimal for most. Leather and chainmail were expensive, reserved for the elite. Mobility often outweighed protection, especially in riverine raids where speed was critical. Tactics varied depending on the target. Coastal and river raids relied on speed and shock. Larger-scale campaigns, such as the Great Heathen Army in England, employed siege techniques, encampments, and multi-pronged attacks. Vikings were not merely opportunistic marauders. They could sustain prolonged campaigns, coordinate between multiple forces, and adapt to unexpected resistance. Leaders such as Ivar the Boneless in England demonstrated strategic cunning, combining patience with ruthless action to achieve political objectives. Naval warfare also demanded coordination and innovation. Ships could be lashed together to form temporary floating fortresses, allowing boarding or defense against counterattacks. Signals, such as horns or flags, communicated across fleets. Coordination extended beyond battle. Supply lines were meticulously maintained, often including livestock, preserved food, and equipment to support campaigns lasting months or years. Logistics, often overlooked in historical narratives, were as vital as combat skill. The human element cannot be understated. Viking warriors relied on social bonds, loyalty to leaders, and the promise of reward, plunder, land, or prestige. Raiding was dangerous, and casualties could be high, yet the system of kinship, obligation, and shared risk created cohesion. Fear was managed internally, courage and reputation were central values. Failure could mean dishonor, while success ensured wealth and social advancement. Viking raiding also required intelligence. Scouts, informants, and local collaborators provided critical information. Knowledge of tides, seasonal weather patterns, and river navigation was essential. They observed enemy routines, habits, and defenses. A monastery or village taken by surprise demonstrates that the Vikings were masters of reconnaissance and timing, turning observation into strategic advantage. Psychologically, raiding was as much about controlling populations as defeating armies. A small Viking force could extract tribute or submission from a town by demonstrating ruthlessness, leaving destruction behind as a warning to others. Reputation spread faster than the Longships themselves. Communities would sometimes choose compliance over resistance, paying silver or goods to prevent violence. The Vikings understood that fear and perception were weapons as effective as the sword. Yet Viking warfare was not mindless cruelty. It was also adaptive and pragmatic. If a target was fortified, they could negotiate, demand, tribute, or retreat and attack elsewhere. Prolonged sieges were rare, but not unheard of, often combining intimidation with negotiation. Leaders balanced risk and reward, calculating whether an assault, payment, or withdrawal best served long-term objectives. This strategic flexibility allowed a smaller force to exert influence far beyond its numbers. Vikings also incorporated new technologies and tactics from the peoples they encountered. In England, they learned siege techniques and adjusted to fortified towns. In Francia, they adapted to local cavalry and defensive structures. In the East, river warfare required different formations and coordination. Their ability to absorb and innovate based on experience made them enduringly effective across diverse regions. Religion and belief also shaped the mindset of warriors. The Norse concept of honor, fate, and the afterlife influenced how Vikings approached combat. Death in battle was not merely survival risk, it was a path to Valhalla, a reward that reinforced courage and commitment. Rituals before and after raids, the carrying of charms, and the invocation of gods were psychological tools as much as spiritual observances. They reinforced group cohesion and individual resolve. Even beyond the battlefield, Viking strategy considered governance and control. In England, after the Great Heathen Army, raiders did not simply leave. They imposed tribute, administered territories, and integrated themselves into local politics. In Normandy, raiders became dukes. In the Kievan Rus, Norse leaders became rulers. War was the first step, but sustainability required organization, diplomacy, and the capacity to administer. This combination of aggression and administration set Vikings apart from many contemporary raiders. Viking warfare also had a moral dimension within their society. Feuds, vengeance, and the protection of kin were central. Battles often arose from obligations to family or community honor. Retaliation could perpetuate cycles of violence, but it was socially structured, governed by laws and customs. Even raiding, while violent, operated within an understanding of obligation and reward. Think for a moment of a raid on an English village in the 9th century. Longships appear at dawn, warriors leap ashore, horns blare. The villagers, terrified, gather what valuables they can. The raid lasts hours. The Vikings take silver, food, and captives. Some resist and are killed, others flee. The raiders leave, sails disappearing over the horizon. To outsiders, it is chaos. To the Vikings, it is controlled, profitable, and purposeful. Every action is calculated, every risk weighed, every advantage exploited. Viking warfare, therefore, was a combination of innovation, fear management, skill, and social organization. It relied on the mastery of the sea and rivers, precise reconnaissance, and the psychological manipulation of opponents. It was brutal, yes, but it was also intelligent and adaptive, a sophisticated system that allowed a relatively small group to leave an outsized mark on history. And yet, one must reflect, the same cunning that allowed Vikings to strike terror also made them capable of settlement, trade, and governance. What does it tell us about human societies when the tools of fear can become the instruments of building kingdoms, fostering trade, and establishing enduring cultural legacies? By the late 11th century, the era of Viking raids, exploration, and conquest was drawing to a close. The reasons were multiple: stronger centralized kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, and shifts in climate and trade patterns gradually reduced the advantages that had allowed Norsemen to dominate Europe for centuries. Yet, decline does not mean disappearance. Instead, Viking societies transformed, integrating into the political, religious, and economic fabric of medieval Europe, while leaving a legacy that would endure for centuries. One of the primary factors in the decline was the consolidation of kingdoms. In England, Alfred the Great and his successors strengthened fortifications, created standing forces, and implemented systems of early taxation and administration. By the end of the 11th century, Anglo-Saxon England was far more capable of resisting raids than it had been during the 9th and 10th centuries. Similarly, in Francia, emerging kings and dukes could mobilize larger armies and enforce law more consistently. The era in which a small fleet of longships could terrorize towns and monasteries with impunity was ending. Christianization played a crucial role as well. By adopting Christianity, Norse leaders were integrated into the larger European world. Conversion was both religious and political. Christian kings and bishops expected adherence to church law and morality, which gradually curtailed the independent raiding culture that had flourished under pagan traditions. Churches became both moral and logistical centers, and Norse rulers increasingly participated in ecclesiastical networks. In Normandy, Rollo's descendants exemplified this transition, ruling as Christian dukes and engaging in alliances and marriages with other European nobles. Climate and environmental changes may also have influenced the decline. Some historians suggest that colder winters and shorter growing seasons in Scandinavia and Greenland put pressure on Norse settlements. Greenland's colonies began to struggle with diminishing resources, and Iceland's marginal farmland limited population expansion. These factors, combined with the stabilization of other European regions, reduced both the need and the opportunity for raiding abroad. Despite the decline of raiding, the Norse influence persisted in multiple ways. In the British Isles, former Viking territories became the foundation for new political structures. The Danelaw in England, for instance, integrated Norse law, language, and customs into Anglo-Saxon society. Towns established by Vikings, like Dublin and York, remained major economic centres, connecting local populations to broader trade networks. Even the names of places, rivers, and islands often preserve their Scandinavian roots, a subtle but enduring imprint of settlement. In Eastern Europe, the legacy of the Varangians and the Kievan Rus continued through dynastic and cultural lines. Slavic states retained aspects of Norse governance, military organization, and trade networks. Rurikid descendants maintained influence for centuries, integrating Scandinavian practices into Slavic society while gradually adopting local traditions and Christianity. The fusion of Viking and Slavic elements shaped political, military, and cultural trajectories in ways that would resonate long after raids ceased. Maritime knowledge, too, was preserved and adapted. Longship design, navigation techniques, and seafaring skills passed into local traditions, influencing shipbuilding and trade across Europe. Coastal communities that had once feared Viking raids eventually benefited from the very maritime expertise that these raiders had introduced. Ports, shipyards, and trade routes continued to thrive, often under the control of descendants of the very people who had once threatened them. Culturally, the Norse left a rich literary and artistic legacy. Sagas, poetry, and mythological stories survived in Iceland and elsewhere, recording both heroic deeds and mundane life. These works provide invaluable insight into the worldview, values, and daily experiences of Norse societies. Even as Scandinavia became increasingly Christian and politically integrated into Europe, these narratives preserved memory, shaping literature, folklore, and historical imagination for generations. The Viking Age also left a genetic and demographic imprint. Settlers in Normandy, England, Ireland, and the North Atlantic islands intermarried with local populations. Scandinavian traits, both physical and cultural, were absorbed into broader European societies. This blending created new communities with hybrid identities, capable of navigating both their Norse heritage and the emerging medieval order. Trade networks established by the Vikings persisted as well. From the British Isles to Byzantium, Scandinavia to the Caspian, trade in furs, silver, slaves, and luxury goods had connected regions for centuries. Even as raiding declined, these commercial pathways remained active. The Norse were no longer marauders but merchants, settlers, and administrators, integrating into the economic systems they had once exploited. Despite their decline as raiders, Vikings continued to play roles in European politics and warfare. Norman lords conquered England, Sicily, and parts of southern Italy. Varangian guards served in Constantinople, influencing military and political affairs far from Scandinavia. In these ways, Norse descendants transitioned from raiders to rulers, ensuring that their skills, discipline, and ambition remained influential. Even everyday practices persisted. Agricultural techniques, craft skills, and seafaring methods developed during the Viking Age became standard in European communities. The longhouse evolved into medieval hall structures. Maritime innovations informed shipbuilding for trade and warfare. Ordinary life, once the backbone of Viking survival, now contributed to the broader evolution of European societies. By the end of the 11th century, the Viking Age was no longer defined by sudden raids, fearsome longships, or pagan rituals. Instead, it had become an era of cultural synthesis, where Norse traditions merged with local customs across Europe. Political, economic, and social structures, shaped by the Vikings, endured long after the axes were laid down. Their world had changed, but the legacy remained. And yet, one is left to ponder: how much of what we associate with the Viking Age, its courage, daring, and adaptability, survives not in the dramatic moments of battle or exploration, but in the quieter, everyday practices that allowed communities to endure and thrive long after the raids ended. As the Viking Age faded into the 12th century, it left behind a complex, multi-layered legacy. The era of raiding, exploration, and settlement had ended, but the echoes of Norse influence persisted across Europe, the North Atlantic, and even into the imagination of later generations. Understanding this legacy requires stepping back to see not only what the Vikings conquered or destroyed, but also what they built, adapted, and transformed in the world around them. One of the clearest marks of their influence is geographic and cultural. Names of towns, rivers, and regions in England, Ireland, Scotland, and Normandy preserve the imprint of Norse settlement. Dublin, York, Orkney, and the Shetlands are not merely place names. They are living evidence of a people who navigated oceans, rivers, and unknown lands to establish footholds that endure today. In Iceland and Greenland, the settlements they carved from volcanic soil and ice continue to inform local culture and identity. Even in parts of Eastern Europe, the traces of Varangian rule and Kievan Rus foundations persist in historical memory and political lineage. But the Viking legacy is not limited to geography. Their innovations in maritime technology reshaped navigation, shipbuilding, and trade. Longships, light, fast, and flexible, set a standard for river and sea travel. Knowledge of winds, tides, and celestial navigation spread as Norse explorers ventured west to Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland, and south and east through rivers and seas. This mastery of mobility allowed them to connect distant regions, fostering trade networks that would endure long after the age of raiding. Their techniques influenced European naval construction for centuries, enabling subsequent generations to explore, trade, and wage war more effectively. Trade itself remained a central element of Viking influence. Scandinavian merchants had established extensive networks connecting the North Sea, the Baltic, the British Isles, Eastern Europe, and Byzantium. These networks brought furs, silver, amber, and slaves from the north into global markets, while importing silks, spices, coins, and luxury goods into Scandinavia. Even as Viking raids declined, these routes facilitated economic integration across Europe, contributing to the rise of medieval urban centers and long-distance commerce. In essence, the Vikings were both destroyers and connectors, shaping the flow of goods, ideas, and culture. Religion and culture underwent profound transformation during this period. The shift from paganism to Christianity was not merely spiritual, it was political and social. By adopting Christianity, Norse leaders integrated into European systems of power, law, and diplomacy. Churches and monasteries, once targets of raiding, became centers of community, learning, and administration under Viking influence. Yet pagan traditions, rituals, and stories survived in sagas, poetry, and oral memory, preserving a cultural identity that continues to fascinate historians and enthusiasts today. The Norse sagas, written down centuries later in Iceland, are among the most enduring cultural contributions of the Viking Age. They preserve tales of heroism, exploration, and everyday life, blending history, legend, and moral instruction. Through these narratives, we glimpse the mindset of a people for whom survival, honor, and adaptation were inseparable. Even the mundane farming, trading, building receives attention, demonstrating that historical significance lies not only in conquest but also in the rhythms of daily life. The sagas are not simply stories, they are repositories of collective memory, ethics, and identity, offering insight into how ordinary and extraordinary lives were lived. Politically, the Vikings reshaped medieval Europe. In Normandy, they became dukes who would conquer England, Sicily, and southern Italy. In Eastern Europe, the Varangians founded dynasties that influenced Slavic states for centuries. These transformations illustrate a central theme of the Viking Age: the ability of a society rooted in raiding and exploration to adapt, settle, and integrate into existing political systems. Conquest and assimilation were intertwined, demonstrating flexibility that ensured lasting influence beyond immediate violence. Even the social structure and everyday practices of the Norse left a lasting impact. Agricultural techniques, building methods, and craft skills were integrated into European traditions. Maritime expertise enabled trade and exploration far beyond Scandinavian homelands. The emphasis on family, loyalty, and community, developed in harsh northern climates, helped sustain societies through adversity. In essence, the Viking Age was not only about dramatic events and voyages, but also about the practical knowledge and social systems that allowed a culture to survive, adapt, and thrive. The Viking legacy is also psychological and symbolic. For centuries, Europeans regarded Vikings with fear, awe, and fascination. The image of the longship, the warrior with an axe or sword, and the daring explorer became embedded in European consciousness. Over time, these symbols evolved from threats to models of adventure, resilience, and independence. In modern times, they continue to inspire literature, film, and cultural identity, serving as reminders of human curiosity, courage, and the capacity to endure. The lessons of the Viking Age extend beyond history books. They reveal the importance of adaptability, strategic thinking, and social cohesion in survival. They demonstrate how exploration, even in harsh or unknown environments, can create enduring cultural and economic connections. They show that legacy is not only the product of conquest but also of daily endurance, innovation, and the ability to integrate with new societies. The Vikings, for all their violence and boldness, exemplify a balance between risk and resilience, between disruption and creation. Even in decline, the Vikings shaped the medieval world. As raiding subsided, the skills, networks, and cultural practices they developed were absorbed into broader European systems. Former raiders became rulers, merchants, and settlers. Their ships carried goods instead of plunder. Their halls hosted diplomacy instead of raiding councils. The transformation was gradual but profound. The Viking Age ended not with sudden disappearance, but through integration, leaving a permanent mark on the landscapes, societies, and imaginations of Europe. Pause for a moment and imagine the scope of this legacy. From the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Russia, from the coasts of England to Greenland and Vinland, the Vikings travelled, traded, fought, and settled. They influenced politics, economy, culture, and religion. They survived harsh climates, navigated treacherous seas, and adapted to foreign lands. Their descendants shaped kingdoms, cities, and trade networks, and in literature, art, and memory, their stories continue to resonate. So, as we look back on the Viking Age, we see more than raiders and explorers. We see a people whose curiosity, resilience, and adaptability reshaped the medieval world. Their lives remind us that history is composed not only of battles and voyages, but also of the ordinary moments of survival, the networks of trade and kinship, and the slow transformations that leave lasting marks on human civilization. The Vikings were, in essence, architects of connection, builders of societies, and pioneers of endurance. And one final thought lingers. When we admire the daring of Viking voyages, the cunning of their strategies, and the richness of their culture, we must also recognize the quiet, often overlooked contributions of daily life, the families who farmed, the craftsmen who built, the communities that endured. Without these ordinary threads, the extraordinary feats of the Viking Age would have been impossible. Their story is a reminder that history is never made by heroes alone, but by the resilience and ingenuity of people who lived, worked, and adapted in every ordinary day.